All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to today's Portland State University Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm Director of TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University, and I will be introducing and moderating, mainly introducing today's seminar. So today we are very pleased to have Kyle Smith, Sumi Malik, and Jerry Mincer presenting on the HUD Thriving Communities Technical Assistance, Incorporating Housing into Transportation Planning. I'm going to do some introductions of our speakers. Um, I'm going to start with Jerry Mincer. She manages a variety of interdisciplinary projects on housing, zoning, and economic development and leads technical assistance efforts to help local leaders make data-driven decisions about how and where to grow their communities. Since 2011, Jerry has worked across a variety of Smart Growth America's programs and disciplines, including advocacy campaigns, public engagement, and transportation reform. Kyle Smith has 18 years of experience at the intersection of housing, land use, and transportation, including local housing planning, transit-oriented development, and zoning reforms. He serves as project manager for the HUD Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Program and chief subject matter expert for an FHWA housing coordination guidebook for MPOs and from ICF. Sumi Malik brings 20 years of experience as a multimodal transportation planner, increasingly focused on the intersection of transportation and housing. She serves as ICF's project manager for the FHWA Housing Coordination Planning Project, leading engagement with MPOs and other stakeholders. And I am very proud to say that she is an alum of Portland State University, so we're very happy to have her here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sumi, Kyle, and Jerry.
Great. Well, hello. How's everyone doing? My name is Kyle Smith. I am a senior manager of housing and community development at ICF, and the project manager for one of the technical assistance teams for the HUD Thriving Communities TA program. We have already been introduced. So we will at least be a little bit brief in introducing ourselves. My name is Kyle Smith. You heard a little bit about my bio. I've worked 18 years at the intersection of housing and transportation with HUD. Before that, I worked across the Chicago region um, uh, in a mayor's and municipal organization helping with local and regional housing planning. And then before that, 8 years at the Center for Neighborhood Technology on housing and transportation costs. I'm joined here by my colleagues, Sumi and Jerry, and I'd love to give them a chance to introduce themselves.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Sumi Malik with ICF. I'm a transportation planner with 20 years of planning experience and also serve as the transportation subject matter expert on the Thriving Communities HUD technical assistance effort. The last eight of those years have been focused on the intersection of transportation and housing and the integration of the two, including a study for Oregon Department of Transportation on transit and housing. And to Jerry.
Hi there, Jerry Mincer, bringing about a dozen years in the nonprofit sector, focused mostly on land use and economic development. And I also support a lot of SGA's research and technical assistance work. Happy to be here with you all.
Great. Thank you, Sumi. Thank you, Jerry. So we are here as members of the HUD Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Program. And I want to tell you a little bit about the program. Um, the program was established by HUD and launched in 2023, designed to help local governments boost housing supply near federally funded transportation improvements. And that can be a wide range of improvements from large competitive grants to infrastructure projects funded by formula funds at the state or regional levels. Through this program, local governments can receive TA to identify and position specific sites for redevelopment into housing, including those in opportunity zones, which have recently been made permanent, to stabilize communities and preserve affordable housing and family-friendly housing when transportation improvements come online, to reform local regulations such as building or zoning codes, to accelerate housing production, and to build stakeholder partnerships, including with developers, which we'll talk about later, the importance of that. We are joined today by our HUD program officer, Leah Anderson. Thank you for joining us, Leah. And I believe she has said we can provide her info in the chat for anyone who wishes to be in touch with HUD. The three of us, we are representing one of two technical assistance teams for this TA program. This is a partnership. This particular event's a partnership between ICF and Smart Growth America. ICF is a leading global solutions and consulting provider. We provide services across the policy arenas, which include housing, transportation, community development, and transportation. Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit that connects the dots between these sectors and helps communities advance integrated transportation, land use, and housing initiatives. So we are here together for about 90 minutes to talk about the integration of transportation and housing. But before we do, we are here representing a technical assistance program, and direct technical assistance is available to local governments wishing to do this work. It is tailored assistance to help communities build capacity to coordinate these two things effectively. Things that have been produced through the TCTA program in the past include housing implementation plans, providing various policy options, stakeholder workshops, and best practices. To be eligible for the TA program, local governments must be receiving or will receive federal transportation funding either directly or through a state pass-through. And priority is given to local governments under 250,000 people. So we are scratching the surface today. But for those of you representing local governments, we want to let you know that this technical assistance is available as a follow-up. There is a link here on the slide, and we will drop that in the chat as well. Additionally, for those of you attending today, that are from local governments, you may also be eligible for short-term technical assistance. I would like to emphasize that short-term TA is highly targeted. It is not the same as the direct technical assistance described earlier, but there might be hours available from our team to help you build capacity. And some example things that our team could do under the short-term TA could include one-on-one coaching with you on some of the topics that we talk about today, a quick memo on housing strategy, providing best practices that are covered today, etc. The eligibility is the same. Short-term technical assistance is for local governments that are receiving or will receive federal transportation funding either directly or through a pass-through such as a state DOT. And again, the priority is for those local governments under 250,000. If you're interested, please reach out to me directly. And please let us know that you attended this session today. And if we can link it to what's interested, we can talk about the short-term technical assistance. Okay, so today's agenda is designed to help you better align housing strategies with transportation planning. And we're going to do this a few different ways. So we're going to open up with some polls so that we can just talk to you all and level set about our starting point. Then we're going to go through two learning modules. The first is about transportation planning. and the mechanisms and process to time housing within it. The second is on housing development mechanisms, including land use and development mechanisms. And then we'll close and we'll have some time for question and answer. So before we get started with any of that, though, I wanted to bring up a few considerations. So first of all, today's content is focused on strategies for units of local government, such as municipalities or counties. Though that is the target audience for HUD Thriving Communities TA. But we have seen the registration list. We know that many are here from MPOs and state DOTs, and the lessons that are learned here are broader. They're for all of us, and I think that they can be applied to those of us that coordinate with local governments. Additionally, those local governments, for those of you from MPOs or DOTs, might be eligible for TCTA. So we hope you can keep that in mind too over the next 90 minutes. In terms of a format, we want to help you build capacity. So we did not design these 90 minutes to just do some slides. We mixed them together with some polling questions. We'd really like to poll you on your starting point, what kinds of strategies you're interested in, you've tried, or like to talk about. There's also a question and answer box. And so we'll be monitoring the questions submitted. We do have a Q&A formally at the end of the 90 minutes, but we're hoping that we can take a look at the box and just speak to some of the questions and talk with you all as we go. So that's another way of saying, don't be shy. Please use any of these options. The more we can talk to each other through the Q&A box and the polling, I think the more we'll have a really great session. Great. So I'm going to give it now to my colleague Matt, who will walk us through our first polling exercise.
Hey everyone, this is Matt Briley with ICF. I'm a community development specialist supporting the HUD Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Program. And today we're going to be using an interactive polling website called AHA Slides. So you can participate on your phone by scanning the QR code on screen or on your browser on your computer, clicking the link that was shared in the chat or typing in the URL on the screen right here. So first we're going to just start out with some introductory questions to get us warmed up. Here we go. Looks like we got folks participating already, so hand it back to you, Kyle.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to be able to keep up with everyone. We'll give this a minute for the polls to come in, the poll results to come in, rather. There is a little bit of a lag. It looks like so far we've got primarily local governments and MPOs. Got a few from the state. It's almost like watching a leaderboard. I'm going to give this a few minutes, given the large volume of attendees, to continue to give answers. So primarily today we've got local governments and MPOs, and that's great to know. I think some of the strategies that we'll talk about are relevant at the local level, but I think that they're also very relevant at the regional level, particularly with regard to transportation planning. Let's give this just a minute longer. I see we have a question in the Q&A about responding to the poll. Maybe one of us can reply to that. If anyone else is having issues, please speak up. Awesome. Let's go to the next question. All right. What best describes your role? Again, this is almost like watching a little bit of a leaderboard, so I will annoyingly chit-chat as these come in. It looks like we have a number of transportation planners, a few housing and land use planners, a few consultants, a few academics. Majority are transportation planners. I'll have to be very careful. I've warned everybody, I speak later. I'm a housing planner. I will try my best not to use terms that keep everyone's head spinning out of housing. Majority transportation planners. That's great. Okay. Where are you located um, across this country or this world? You've got a great national spread here. We're moving so quickly that it's hard for me to keep track here, but I see the Midwest, I see the Eastern Seaboard, I see the Western United States, I see a few Southern states, some Texas locations. Wow. Well, it's not surprising that Portland and Oregon are our largest, given um, the forum for the webinar. We've got representation from all over the place. And I think that's amazing. The extent to which we have some free form questions later, the extent to which you have things going on that are unique to your particular region, especially your housing market, please say so, because I think a big part of this work is sharing practices. All right. So we got about 4 minutes for this one. Those were easy. This one's a little tougher. What is the top barrier for increasing housing supply in your community? And it's a word cloud again. So we'll give this one a minute. Politics, cost, high construction costs. So just to speak to that a little bit, I think that's true a number of places, both long entitlement times, the cost of lending and the cost of materials contribute a lot. Seeing a lot on cost. I'm also seeing zoning as a significant barrier. One thing I've seen in different markets is that the zoning or building regulations can prohibit certain types of housing outright. They can also make it very funky to build certain types of housing to comply with the regulations, which increases their cost. Aging houses, which I'm glad someone brought that up. I live in a region with a aging housing supply, and many homes in need of rehabilitation and repair. There's a lot of focus right now on housing, on building new housing, but in many regions of the United States, there are aging homes, and I think that needs to be considered from a transportation perspective. The availability of land, that's an interesting one, and I think something we'll talk about a little bit later is the kinds of sites that can be made available for new housing, and the uh, transportation planning role in that. So thanks for adding that. Seeing things on market dynamics, uh, building the wrong housing. That's something I've seen. I've talked about. I don't know if this resonates with folks, but there is a demographic mismatch at times between the housing being produced and how regions are changing. My home region, like many regions, has an aging population, but we historically in my region have not built a lot of homes sized for older adults. And every time a starter home comes on the market in a prime location near services and transportation, it flies off the market. Water, there's a few here that we haven't covered yet. I'm seeing some more come in. Permitting times, a lot of emphasis right now on speeding up permitting times, but it can take a long, long time in some places for housing development to be approved. And in a high interest rate development environment, time is money. That's a real barrier. I see participants are still typing, so I am just gonna do a minute or two longer here. I'm hoping we can hold on to all of these, and come back to them a little bit later when we come back to the polls. Just one more. I see someone said low-income housing tech credits. Um, those have actually been recently expanded in legislation last year. That doesn't mean that there's an easy environment for those credits to finance housing in the right places with the right access. So that would be something I'd be curious to hear a little bit about later. Okay, let's move on. Okay, I am now going to turn it over to my colleague Sumi to talk about integrating housing into transportation planning.
Great, thanks, Kyle. Let's dive into the first module, integrating housing in transportation planning. So in this module, we will examine how to integrate housing consideration into transportation planning, both long-range planning in the transportation improvement program process and at the project level, planning through design and construction. Let's start with long-range planning. For those of you who are transportation planners, this planning cycle will look familiar to you. This represents a general long-range planning cycle that happens at the state level, MPO level, and at the local level, county and city, and housing can be integrated at every stage. Let's break down the long-range planning process a little bit more. So during the problem and needs analysis, your community may discover you have a combined housing and transportation cost burden that is greater than 45% of household incomes, indicating you have an affordability issue. You may also find areas with high home values have a lot of low wage jobs in the area, but no affordable housing, driving up transportation costs for people with low incomes. From needs analysis flows goals and objectives, which may include reducing that housing and transportation cost burden or compact affordable development. Transportation solutions could be housing supportive solutions, those that increase access to housing. During scenario planning, different housing futures could be modeled. For example, the Regional Transportation Commission of Southern Nevada modeled different housing futures in their scenario planning as part of their long-range planning process. The housing futures included growth based on existing patterns and also a scenario with housing growth in particular, occurring along corridors and centers. Evaluating these scenarios can include different effects on the percentage of housing near transit, the percentage of housing in activity centers, and other affordability measures. During the prioritization process of transportation plans, housing connections can be prioritized. And also other studies can support the long-range planning process, such as housing needs analysis, sub-area plans, and economic development plans. During the transportation improvement programming process, housing-related criteria can be included. In the Cincinnati area, the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Regional Council of Governments prioritizes projects by evaluating their consistency with local land use plans, including plans for housing. We'll talk in a few more moments about what can be done during the project development stage to stabilize adjacent housing and the timing of considerations such as zoning changes. Over time, setting targets for monitoring process is very important. So some of those measures can be reducing that housing and transportation combined cost burden and increasing housing production, meeting housing production targets. Great. At the project level, real estate development reacts to transportation infrastructure investments. This interaction starts early at the community visioning and problem definition stage with land use speculation. That's when it begins. You may say to yourself, well, what is the best time to consider housing? It's now. Wherever you are in this process of developing a transportation project, now is the best time to consider housing. During the planning phase, particularly when alignments are selected and there's greater certainty of where those transportation investments are going to go, adjacent property values increase and the potential for community destabilization grows. During preliminary design and environmental review, buyers start to assemble property for redevelopment. Often during construction, this is when real estate development begins, which is ideally compact and affordable, but that often is not the case. And this interaction can occur with a number of different types of transportation projects. Could be the provision of high quality transit, streetscape projects, bicycle lanes with traffic calming, or reconnecting a once disconnected street grid. After construction, rents increase and land scarcity affects the ability to develop affordable housing. During the transportation planning process, there are ways to understand the potential for housing price increases. Some key questions to identify risks are: what is the existing affordability of housing in the area? Is there naturally occurring affordable housing that would benefit from protection, or is it already a high-cost area? What are housing needs, particularly unmet needs by housing type? Is affordable housing located in neighborhoods with transportation access and access to daily needs? Also, it's really important to understand prior impacts. Are incomes keeping pace with rising costs? Is there a mismatch between community needs and housing being developed? Kyle alluded to this in the prior, but something that we have discovered in delivering this technical assistance is that oftentimes communities, just as an example, communities may see an abundance of single bedroom apartments being built, but they really have an unmet need for family-friendly multifamily housing. And also, what is the housing supply relative to demand? Is there a mismatch between new housing development, transportation, and access to daily needs? Oftentimes, housing is developed at the fringes of a community, driving up transportation costs. Next slide. So subsequent speakers will address this in more detail, but how do we stabilize housing when transportation projects come online? At the planning stage, actions that anticipate market responses can include zoning changes, land assembly, and establishing development organizations. Preservation strategies can include actions to protect naturally occurring affordable housing. And increasing housing production alongside right-of-way acquisition and construction can help stabilize a community that has a transportation project coming online. Also important is protecting residents from rapidly increasing rent and home values through construction and operation. And now we have some more polling questions. So this is to help us all understand where we all are at. Does your community integrate housing in its long-range transportation planning process? And given the other types of technical assistance we've been providing and practicing in this area for some time, I would expect this graph to skew towards the left. Intuitively, it may seem like transportation and housing is integrated regularly, but as we know as practitioners, transportation planning is more and project development is more centralized, whereas housing production and preservation is far more diffuse. So So they actually can become quite siloed. Okay, so it seems like we are an average of 2.3, kind of a little bit less than sometimes, a little bit more towards never. And this is, I would say this is pretty expected. This is fairly common. And this is why we're doing this work to try to integrate the two components more meaningfully. Does your community integrate housing when prioritizing transportation improvement projects? For example, during the TIP process. Okay, interesting. Ooh, this is jumping around quickly. I thought we were going to have an answer that skewed more towards the right, and don't think so. So similarly, it seems like, and we'll give it a few moments to have more questions come in, or answers rather. But similarly, it seems as if it is integrated somewhat. Housing is integrated somewhat into the project prioritization process, but a little bit closer to never than always, which again is expected, which is why we're offering this technical assistance to provide more meaningful integration. Great, let's go to the next one. Does your community integrate housing when developing and evaluating transportation projects? So what is happening at the project level? I would expect a little bit more at the project level, but we'll see. You know, it's actually looking like it's about the same. We have an average of 2.1, 2.2. And this is where we can see community destabilization happen quite a bit. And so obviously having policy measures that precede the project development and integrate housing meaningfully is helpful. That sets the direction. Integrating housing at the project level is really critical to stabilize communities. And this is another word cloud question, so we'd love to get just your initial thoughts. How does your community integrate housing into transportation planning? Exploring transit-oriented development. I think all of us are trying to be very conscientious of spelling out all of the acronyms that we typically use, knowing that we have a very mixed audience. As an afterthought, yeah, that happens a lot. But that's why it's important to start now. Wherever you are in the process, start now. Adopting a strategic housing plan, that is certainly something that a lot of places are doing. A lot of communities are adopting housing plans. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of we don't, we could, lots of lip service. That happens as well. Zoning reform along priority transportation corridors. That is something that we've seen. If those transportation corridors, particularly high quality transit corridors, become core and kind of fixed, then zoning reform and development can be coordinated with that. And it is complicated. It is complicated, which the subsequent speakers will get into a lot more. So there's a lot of really rich information and really interesting to see what people are putting in the polling when agencies talk to each other. So yes, sometimes it happens on a very ad hoc basis, not on a systematized basis. Along high frequency networks. Yeah, and there are capacity constraints. You know, there are staffing constraints, funding constraints, and And so that is a reality that we all work within, and that's partly why the HUD technical assistance offering is is on the table for you all. We're hoping to expand that capacity. Great. All right. Well, I think this concludes the transportation planning module of this session, and I can turn it back um, to you, Matt.
I think at this point I'll jump in. And thank you, Sumi. So I was really interested to learn from all of you on what practices are out there. We want to now talk about a few housing development mechanisms for consideration, as well as some case studies, which we'll talk about, over the next 40 minutes or so. So, one thing that I think is very important to think about with planning for housing that is maybe doubly important when thinking about how to coordinate it with transportation is that there is no panacea or silver bullet to solve what is a growing housing crisis in many communities. The roots of the housing crisis are multifaceted. They link to everything from um, uh, underbuilding to need for rehabilitation and repair, to choices in transportation investments made 30 or 40 years ago. Those things aren't fixed with a single action. The only way to address is to address incrementally with many different actions layered together. And I'm going to go over a few housing actions. I don't expect everyone in this room to be an expert on these. But I do want to emphasize that there are four different pillars or um, different parts of the circle to consider and put together into one integrated strategy. So, first of all, one of the things that a lot of you spoke about were reforms to increase the overall supply of housing. I heard a lot of people speak to transit-oriented development. I assume that are it includes various strategies to change regulations around transportation to allow for TOD. And that is a great way to increase the overall supply of housing in your community. However, those reforms alone won't affect the price or the configuration of the housing and must be paired with strategies to increase new income restricted housing or what is commonly called affordable housing. Um, that can be done with zoning incentives. It can be done with the redevelopment of public land, which we'll talk about, partners such as community land trusts. If the two are not paired together, there is a chance that the housing will not be at the price points or configuration that communities need. There's also a great need for preservation of existing affordable housing, particularly naturally occurring affordable housing. And that's a whole different set of strategies that can include fees on demolition, working on home repair programs with community action agencies, local rental regulation programs. Those we won't get into as much, but they have to be a part of the picture in many regions. And then finally, we've talked a lot about building and preserving. Our neighbors, folks around us, they live in housing. And there need to be also actions in place. There should be actions in place to help protect and serve those who rent and own in the community. All right, so that's lesson number one. Um, Lesson number two, if your heads are spinning from all of these different programs and terms, don't worry. I think that that's very common within housing planning. I'm speaking to a number of transportation planners here. I hope I don't get in trouble in saying this. Your world is more hierarchical and centralized than that world of housing planning and investment. I think that part of the disconnect is that there is a there's a complex but clear flow of primarily federal funding as well as state and local money through a metropolitan and state planning process. MPOs, state DOTs, transit agencies program the funds. You go through key plans. There is quite a bit of work involved in that, but there is a clear route. It is not that way in housing. In housing, you have three different categories of entities, all of which with their own responsibility and governance. At the local level, you have cities that enable the housing. We've already talked about TOD, we've talked about zoning. TOD plans, land use plans, corridor plans, those govern where things can be built. But those plans and those communities don't build the housing. Developers build housing. Nonprofit developers build housing. Public housing authorities build housing. Many of those are private market decisions. Some can follow a strategic plan to build housing, but there is no guarantee at the local level, if regulations are changed, that these actors will choose to build housing. Um, and those entities don't provide the financing for the housing. That's a whole nother set of entities that includes banks, community development finance institutions, state housing finance agencies that allocate low-income housing tax credits, which were mentioned in the chat. They make their own decisions for the projects that they choose to fund and the locations where those are eventually built. Those are a lot of stakeholders to coordinate. And I was really pleased to hear a few places that are saying that the primary thing that they do is bring these entities to the table. Because the reality is, we can talk about best practices all day, and we will share some, but all of these folks need to be brought at the table because most of these decisions are not made by us here in the room. They're made collectively, and um, there is no one planning process that will govern them. So, and I want to share kind of a third word of wisdom, and then I want to turn to my colleague Jerry. There is a lot of emphasis on land use reform right now, on transit-oriented development, on other kinds of changes to land use and zoning regulations for starter homes. That alone is not going to make housing pop out of the ground near transportation improvement. It is a critical element to get started. All of the other elements need to be in place, and there need to be sites available and financing in place to lead to the outcomes of improved affordability and configuration. Land use reform is not going to do that. It is a key starting point, though. And so we'll turn to Jerry now, but I hope you hold on to this because we're going to talk about a couple of mechanisms in a minute to pair with zoning reform that you should consider as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry to talk a little bit about some practices.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. So as Kyle kind of set up really well, there can be a lot of barriers to increasing housing supply near transportation. And when we are making these transportation investments, our land use policies need to keep up. Otherwise, we're leaving a lot on the table, especially when it comes to housing and opportunities to increase affordable housing, different types of housing within our communities. So here on the screen is some of the most common challenges when it comes to land use, as well as some solutions. And this is all in an effort to build more housing in the right place at the right price. That's how we at SGA think about the answer to the housing crisis. So our first barrier that we're going to talk about is single family only residential zones. I think as we all know and can see across the country, a huge portion of land in many communities is zoned single family only. It's up to 75% in some communities. That takes up a lot of space, and you can only build so many homes when those restrictions are in place. And as we're facing a national housing crisis, we need to be using space more efficiently, and single family zoning can get in the way of that. So a solution is to shift away from that approach. And that is one of the ways to unlock some housing. And shout out to our hosts in Oregon, where the first statewide legislation that required communities to allow more housing, specifically missing middle housing, was passed in 2019. And it is context sensitive. So in communities over 10,000, duplexes are allowed in single family zones. And then in larger communities, larger buildings, 4-unit buildings. But even in smaller places, this legislation is passing. In Talent, Oregon, a community of less than 7,000, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, are now allowed everywhere. So there are options for encouraging that gentle density in single family areas where there might not be large amounts of land to redevelop. But this is also really important along transit and commercial corridors that connect to residential areas where there may be some more space opening up for housing, but may currently be zoned as single family. So another barrier, everyone's favorite topic, I'm sure, is parking. Once again, parking takes up a huge amount of space and is very expensive to build, as I'm sure this group well knows. Parking minimums use a one-size-fits-all approach that just does not account for community context or need. Per unit parking requirements for apartment buildings near transit make it harder and more expensive to build housing near those transportation investments, especially for smaller developers outside of major markets. Transportation investments can often reduce the dependency on car travel, but the benefits fall short if the housing that's closest to those investments requires expensive parking to be added. So what are the solutions? Reduce or eliminate parking requirements. That reform means changing the policy from a one-size-fits-all approach to match the local need and context and potentially open up space for more housing. The map on the right is of Duluth, highlighting all of their surface parking lots in their downtown. And in 2023, they eliminated parking minimums citywide and saw a huge spike in permits for more housing. In Norman, Oklahoma, their approach was to change one word in their zoning code from required to recommended about the parking. And that allowed the market to determine what parking was needed, again, based on the context and based on the transportation options available. A couple of other parking strategies include maximum parking. So this allows communities to either limit the amount of spaces based on the use. So for every 1,000 square foot of commercial space, only a certain number of parking spaces can be built, or you can cap the amount of the minimum. So only, for example, 125% of the minimum can be built. And then shared parking is another strategy that we've seen some smaller places take advantage of when buildings or businesses have kind of different business models and peak hours. They can share the parking near their facilities. Another barrier is excessive development standards. So these are restrictive rules and regulations that can limit how much of a lot you can build on. They can create a lot of wasted space, or they can just make it harder to build in general. They can really limit missing middle housing and infill development in a neighborhood context. And even when we rezone to allow or encourage housing near transportation investments, these development standards can prevent the houses that we actually want and to encourage and are supportive of having from getting built. So setbacks and lot coverage rules means that a slightly denser form of housing just won't fit on that lot. It doesn't pencil out. So a solution here is to relax those development standards and allow more missing middle to be built in the areas that are zoned for it. Essentially, that making the standards match the housing goals that you've already set. And a common challenge here is discretionary approval being required for housing that isn't common in a community. So if we aren't typically building duplexes, there's really no clear way to build a duplex. It gets sent to discretionary review. But if all of those projects require special approval, it adds costs, it adds time. We talked about this earlier. It adds uncertainty. And again, these things won't be built because time is money and uncertainty is certain to prevent housing. This image on the right is from Rochester, Minnesota. They passed a unified development code in 2022. And I really like this image. So the code was to modernize their approach to zoning. And I really like this image because it shows how additional units can fit into the fabric of a neighborhood. And there, they simplified the regulations, made them easier to understand, and something like adding an accessory dwelling unit, which is that unit behind the home above a garage, it looks like, became predictable and understandable rather than an uphill battle or an exception to the rules. And here's our last barrier, which is a separation of uses. And this is really traditional zoning. Traditional zoning has separated the things we need from one another and from where we live. We keep restaurants away from neighborhoods. We keep jobs away from residential areas. And the result is more travel, usually driving, needed to access all of our daily needs and in our daily lives. And the result is more parking being needed, more congestion, emissions, more time, money, and resources being used to live our lives. And this is particularly true for lower income households. Sumi alluded to this earlier. Often these families are pushed further from the things that they need to find affordable housing. And then to access jobs, they may have transportation costs consume more of their income and more of their time. So the solution to this is one to allow neighborhood businesses, but really it's about encouraging a mix of uses and businesses within or close to neighborhoods. That can result in less parking being needed, opening up space for more housing, or simply keeping the cost of the housing down. Allowing this mix of uses can also decrease the demand on our road networks and better support mobility, getting people closer to the things that they need. This is an image of a form-based code that was adopted in Iowa City. And form-based codes are a great implementation strategy. They can be applied on a corridor as an overlay in a specific district, and it focuses on the form of the development rather than the use, and better supports walkability and transportation options. And I'll mention too that at Smart Growth America, we do a lot of work on form-based codes, and our Center for Zoning Solutions has a whole inventory of form-based codes across the country that have been implemented and the results. So once again, here's that summary of the barriers and the solutions. And I want to be really clear, these solutions are not easy to achieve. They often go against what has been done in a community for some time, the status quo, how things are, usually, air quote, usually done. They require significant political will, organizing, stakeholder engagement, lots of different people talking to one another. And sometimes they can raise very valid concerns or fears of change. But land use reform alongside transportation investments is how we actually get more housing built in the right places and at affordable prices. So with that, we'll jump into a few polls to hear from you all. So the first question is, which of those solutions or strategies might best support housing near transportation in your community? And these are grouped in the categories that I mentioned. There's a lot that goes under each of these. There's a lot of strategies within them, but the overall topic, which do you feel might work best where you're joining us from? Oh, and thank you to someone in the Q&A for clarifying a change in the Oregon legislation. My information was slightly out of date. Appreciate that. All right, answers are rolling in. Lots of interesting and other types of housing. Glad to see it. I hope this group is familiar with the missing middle housing concept. Still seeing some answers roll in, but other types of housing seems to be the runaway. That is great to see. We often talk about housing for different stages of life. Right now, the market and sort of the development community has long been pushed towards single family homes or large apartment buildings. That's what we're good at building. That's what, the financing is comfortable funding. But there's so much in the middle that can be really great options for, young students coming out of school, older adults wanting to downsize, young families who, don't want to take on a large home or can't afford to. All right. These are great responses. Thanks, everyone. Would also love to hear what land use reform strategies you're currently pursuing or you've already implemented in the communities that you're working in. And this is one of the, I believe, word clouds. Oh no, we're just going to see the different responses pop up. This is great. Corridor planning, mixed use, revising the zoning code, ADUs. Underutilized public land. I hope that's maybe building on underutilized public land. Missing middle housing. Housing needs studies. No maximum density in mixed use zones. Great. Upzoning. Adaptive reuse. This is great. Parking contexts. Oh, I'm curious. I haven't heard that specific term, I don't think, lately, but that's great. Reducing parking minimums, eliminating parking lots from CBDs. Great. Thank you all for all the responses. Standardized approval processes. Love to see that. Density tied to transit. Interesting. Streamlining permitting. This is great. So a lot of increasing density, a lot of streamlining the various rules and regulations and processes to encourage housing. Require different housing types, joint development. That is a great strategy. We've worked a little bit on that, and I know ICF has some good examples of some joint development projects. Pre-approved plans, love that. All right, it looks like folks are still typing, so I'll wait a little longer. Eliminate cul-de-sacs. This is great. We actually were talking at a recent staff meeting of a community where no matter where or what was being built, they did not allow cul-de-sacs so that any development that happened adjacent to what was being built would connect. And it's really changed the way they approach planning and development because everything will now connect as opposed to, oh, well, where this one subdivision ends, it's just completely cut off from anything around it. So that's great. I see more about streamlining the approval process. That's really great. Making it easier to add. Yeah, so that speaks to building code, which I know can be a big challenge. These are great answers. Thank you all. It sounds like you're all working on or pursuing or have already implemented a ton of great stuff. So I'm curious to learn more about all of this. I think we have one more poll. But folks are still typing, so we'll let them. Modular homes, this is great. All right, I'm going to do a last call. If you're finishing a thought, please do, and then we're going to jump to our next poll. This is all great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all the sharing and love to see what's been happening. So we want to ask you to kind of assess how you would take some next steps. What skills or staffing would you need to implement some of these strategies? So if you just shared something that you're interested in or you're starting to work on, what capacity do you need? What help do you need? What's standing in your way of taking the next step? Developer support, local support, educating the public, training for elected officials and decision maker. So information and communication, it sounds like money. Yep. Forward thinking leadership, getting the community and politicians on board, training, advocate training. Okay. So it sounds like there's a fair number of information sharing that would be really helpful to bring people up to speed on what you're trying to do, why it's important, why it matters, getting them on board. Funds to pay for staff to implement. Yep. Okay. Awareness, local agency partnership, benefits for the public, education on benefits for the public, education and information for the community, staff, local government staffing. Local government interest. That's interesting. Using available land inventory, I think I saw. So we actually have a resource on how to do a land inventory if that's of interest. We meaning Smart Growth America, but also a plug for our direct technical assistance, I think could help with a lot of these things. Leadership. Yeah, still seeing a big trend of just getting everyone on the same page, communicating the need, communicating the why this is important, the benefits, and collaboration. Yeah, needing better collaboration. Internal coordination. Yep, this is, as Kyle said in that slide, this is complex. There's silos, there's, you know, lang language barriers when it comes to the different programs and terminologies that are used in the different worlds, the different focus areas. Absolutely. All right, we're gonna give this, let's say, Matt, until 20, when it hits 2:05, we'll move on because I see folks are still typing, but we've gotten a lot of great answers. Incentivize developers to do something different. I think a big part of that is creating certainty. So it's not always just incentive based, though that never hurts. It's if they are interested in building a different type of housing, is it gonna be approved? Is it gonna take years and cost so much in time? Is a big part, is a big a challenge. Yeah, let's go back real quick and just do a, all right. These are some great answers. It sounds like there's a lot happening and you all kind of know what you need next. And I know our team would love to be able to help out in any way that we can. Seeing definitely some themes around making the case, um, expertise, engaging local leadership and the public, and then some more of the technical and coordination focused needs. All right. Thank you all again. That was great. I'm going to hand things back over to Kyle to continue with our module.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. Um, so I actually was looking at a lot of those responses in the capacity assessment. There's a lot going on, as well as a lot of self-awareness on what you need to do next, which is great. Um, I'm hoping that the next few slides are helpful to you all in building on that. I think that one of the things I want to tie a few things together that we talked about earlier. Earlier in this session, Sumi discussed the real estate cycle and how early that land values go up related to a planning of a transportation project. Um, we also talked a little bit about zoning and regulation. However, it's very common with transportation projects that the price of the land goes up so quickly that it's very difficult for the market to build anything but a higher price point project that pencils out financially. The answer isn't always just relying on the market. The answer can come through the direct redevelopment of sites near the transportation asset. And there's a couple of different ways to do this. It is something that I think feels very foreign to a lot of organizations. And there are two routes. The first is to directly acquire these sites near transportation assets to have more control on what's developed on those sites. And we talked about this a little bit in the capacity assessment. That can include the identification and the redevelopment of publicly owned land, which is sometimes, not always, in those key locations. It can include revolving loan funds, including revolving loan funds that are made possible through um, uh, federal funding, including through HUD programs. It can include land donations. There's master lease mechanisms. So many states have land banks that can acquire privately held properties. That's one such mechanism. That's not going to work in every situation. And I've worked with communities that have said, we can't do that. We don't have the capacity for that. We don't have the financial resources for that. And that's common. And in those cases, there are also development partnerships, and those include affordable housing developers as well as community land trusts. I think that the route is probably both of those avenues in many communities. So rather than talk through a series of complex case studies that won't be one size fits all, I'm sorry, complex policies that won't be one size fits all, I'd rather do this in a case study approach. One case study for each of these approaches. So first, with the redevelopment of publicly owned land, I'd like to talk about this example from Sound Transit in the Seattle, Washington area. I did see someone from Sound Transit on the registration list, so if they're in this session, hello, I'm glad we are able to highlight your agency. Um, the agency supports opportunities for development in affordable housing by planning when transit expansion occurs, repositioning those surplus properties after the construction has occurred, such as the land for staging equipment, putting them out for RFP, and then setting priorities for what should be in that RFP through local community engagement. And I just wanted to provide an example of this. I think it's a great example from recent transit expansion into Eastern King County in Redmond, Washington. Um, Sound Transit put out an RFP for a former construction parcel. It was eventually awarded to Bellwether Housing for an affordable housing project. And as a result, the result is a six-story mixed-use project with 328 units of affordable housing, ground floor retail, and some other community space. Sound Transit made a priority in engaging the local community, who in turn provided significant community input for what should be located in that retail space. And it has a financing mix that you can see here from many other sources that were made by Bellwether Housing, which won the RFP. It's expected to open in 2028. So I think that the reuse of this kind of public property, if it's available, particularly after transportation improvements online, is a wonderful avenue for adding of an array of housing options. But we know that's not the avenue in many places. Those parcels might not exist. They might not be in key or ideal locations for housing. They might not be near the transportation improvement. Another avenue that you can consider is partnering with a real estate organization such as a community land trust. And I wanted to provide this example from Denver, Colorado for the Urban Land Conservancy, or ULC. ULC develops and stewards permanently affordable real estate in Colorado through a land bank and a community land trust, CLT. Typically, people can assume that the CLT is a mechanism through which single-family homes or small properties are acquired, redeveloped, and rehabbed into permanently affordable housing. The reality is, it can also be used as a mechanism for multifamily housing near transit. And here's how it works. The ULC uses local revolving funding to acquire the land near transit sites when they come on the market. It owns the land. It puts out a solicitation for developers. And under the solicitation, they're asking the developer to build on. The ULC retains land through what's called a master lease and asks the developer to build the improvements on the site. As part of the agreement, um, uh, the development agreement, the land is held affordable. The property is held affordable for 99 years with an automatic 99-year referral for a total of 198 years of land control. This structure allows ULC to build permanently affordable housing much longer than it's available through the low-income housing tax credit program, outside of any public land mechanism, development, or acquisition mechanism. All right. So this is a little more complex than some of the other things that we've been talking about. So we're going to go back to the poll one more time. And we'd love to hear about some of these redevelopment strategies, particularly for the transportation planners in the room. Um, are these underway in your community? Have any of these been tried or implemented? Let's see some of the results. None. Redevelopment of publicly owned land. See land bank a few partnerships with CLTs. I'd love to hear about that. So it looks like we do have some entities that are redeveloping their land. Would love, to the extent that we can talk about that here, some of the successes and pitfalls because it is complex. Can be. It is also the greatest leverage point for adding affordable or accessible housing. Seeing a few things about land donations, not much about financing, not much about master leases. Okay, let's keep going. All right, I'm super curious to hear the answer to this. Do you agree that you have the technical expertise that you need to do this kind of work? And then we'll ask if you have the partnerships to do this work. I'm really curious to see where this lands. I am not surprised that the partnerships are coming somewhere in the middle. Real estate development is outside what many of us do. I'm actually more surprised about the technical expertise, so I'd love to hear about that in the freeform question. I think the reality about redevelopment is that there is a layer of real estate expertise that is not within the purview of public entities, except for the most sophisticated, including those that have joint development or other real estate programs. And that's typical. And that is why the outside partnership is so key to try and guide development outcomes at key locations. I'm seeing more agreeing than disagreeing and some match both internally and externally. Interesting. All right, let's keep going. All right, so now we're going to go a little free form. Even though we seem to have some of the skills and partnerships we need, what do you need to do this kind of work? A sense of urgency. I mean, I think that that's a fair point. One of the things Sumi said earlier with regard to transportation, the best time to get involved is right now because real estate values go up. Um, they they don't go down. If land is prices are a barrier now, they won't be any less of a barrier in the future. I'm seeing real estate expertise and legal expertise for sure. And you don't necessarily need to have that real estate expertise in-house. You don't need a staff person. You don't need a department. That is something that a consultant can do. So I think for those of us that are local governments that don't have the fiscal capacity to bring someone on, keep that in mind. I'm seeing a lot of different things here, so I'm going to just read off of a few of them. Better locations. Lots of land we own is away from TOD priority locations. That's true too. And I think that there's no desire to be tone deaf here. There's not always going to be a low-hanging fruit site right by transportation. Um, and if anything, I've frequently seen that in some places undergoing new transit expansion, it might be a strip mall. It might be a fully leased commercial property. Um, I have seen, again, this is from the Seattle area, um, a different community. I'll have to go back and look at my list of practices that took out a loan to acquire an aging strip mall and facilitate development itself, and then use that development to pay back the proceeds. So those kinds of strategies are um, something to consider if there's those types of properties that are your key development sites. Willing partners, legal expertise. Yep. Again, that expertise doesn't necessarily need to be somebody that's a full-time employee or, even a, a consultant with a considerable amount of time. You can right-size that expertise to get it into your community. Real estate arm of local government, same thing. You can start small. Um, um, I'm seeing a few other things here. Let's see what else I can read off of. I think if we scroll up a little bit, that would be good. Trust and partnerships with local governments and local agencies. Um, yeah, I think building trust, there's no secret sauce to building trust when it comes to intergovernmental cooperation, but that is key. I mean, I think that even the resources between that might be available for acquiring a site, versus where the local land use regulation is, and might be two completely different entities that just need to be at the table. I've seen that in a number of places, and just building that stakeholder ta table is key. Okay, all right, we got one more, and then we will close and then open up to the Q&A. So we've talked about a few different kinds of solutions. The toolbox is actually pretty vast. What other kinds of tools, solutions, and best practices would you like to explore further to increase housing supply and your transportation in your community? Right, different kinds of transportation alternatives to transit. We didn't really cover that here, but those infrastructure connections are key. Yeah, I've seen the land trust model for multifamily. I love that. That is something in thriving communities that we have worked with two different communities to understand. We actually direct connected them directly to ULC to talk through how they might adapt the land trust and master lease model for multifamily affordable TOD. It does require significant capacity building. It's probably not something that we could talk about in 1 minute or two, but it's definitely a replicable model. I think there's a misconception that land trusts are for single family or small scale development. More on alternative transportation options, um, innovative funding strategies. I'd love to hear a little more. It's hard in this setting, but there are a lot of options out there for financing levers for housing. They include the TIFIA program, the US DOT TIFIA loan credit program, the HUD Section 108 program, for those of you that are a HUD community, can be leveraged towards mixed use development, local sources. So there are things at the table that you can look at, on the table that you can look at. Missing middle, pre-approved building plans. We talked about zoning a little bit. We didn't talk as much about the missing middle as we could have, from what I know Jerry knows. Adaptive reuse of a mall. Um, yeah, that's interesting. Um, and I think that, there are things, some of those commercial properties that can be used for that are not housing, that are complementary with housing. I've seen a former big box near transportation be reused into a senior center with some additions to make it more walkable, that were more um, integrated for multiple modes and supportive of older adult housing in particular. So yeah, that is a common challenge with the decline of some retail types. Yeah, I see education materials to combat NIMBYism. And I think that I would advise, I know this is hard, us to think about how we talk about housing and who we talk about housing with. Because I have talked with a number of communities. I think that education materials are great. It's also helpful to think about how you're talking about housing, how you're framing it. I've been in a number of rooms where we've talked about older adult needs, and some workforce needs in the community, and folks that were um, opposed. Not all of them came around, but a few did. So I think also the right language to engage with residents is important, and not just assume that you're the one educating them. So I would advise that, although I certainly understand the nature of the problem. We have a lot coming in. Um, and I'm going to continue to respond to these for a minute or two. We did have time for the Q&A. But I think that a lot of folks are saying things in the polling box, and so I'm just going to keep talking, assuming that's where we're answering things here. Using federal legislation tools and HUD funds at the local level, including the bill moving through Congress right now. There has been a major housing supply bill that has passed the Senate as of today. It is going back to the U.S. House of Representatives. If that bill does pass Congress, I think that is an interesting opportunity, and one that our team can relay to HUD as well. That certainly will create a lot of opportunity at the local level. See tax incentives and tax credits to redevelop or rezone single-use land areas. That's great. I would put in addition to those, I would put in fee waivers, things that you can do to provide sweeteners in the entitlement review process. All of those things together can be stacked up and help the developer put together a pro forma that allows the project to proceed. And it's usually not just one thing. For them, it's 5 or 6 different things at the state and local level. So, consider all of the tools at your disposal um, on the tax side, as well as with financing partners. And I know I'm not responding to every single thing here, but we're just being a very vocal bunch, and I'm trying to respond to different types of questions as I can. How to encourage development along transit lines that were former historic freight corridors? Ooh, that is a great one, actually. I think those are particularly challenging because so many of the uses are just not very um, compatible uh, with uh, with with housing. I have, yeah, that is a really really great one. I'm trying to think of a couple of examples that um, I've seen. I do think it is a longer term strategy and requires some um, acquisition of a few catalyst projects in those areas to get the right kind of urban form in place. That's a wonderful place for some case studies. At this point, all right, folks are still typing, so let's just give it a minute longer. If we were together in person, I think we would be sitting at a bunch of breakout tables for about 2 hours here. These are some great needs and ideas. Additional funding mechanisms. And we have talked about financing, but I would agree with that assessment. Okay, so we are really just scratching the surface here, but this is great to know. So if we could go back to the presentation. Um, we can cover many of these things, which hopefully we've talked about today, in in the HUD TA for the Thriving Communities program. And this is just a reminder that there are 3 types of technical assistance. There are 2 types of technical assistance available. The first is direct technical assistance, and that is a intensive, more hands-on support on many of these issues. If your communities are interested in that TA, please visit the HUD TCTA webpage and submit the TA request form. There are 2 providers, so you may or may not be matched with us if you are interested or your community is interested. And it looks like we've put that back in the chat box. Additionally, for those who are here today, if there are things that we discussed in the polling, there may be targeted technical assistance available to interface with us on those things. So if you're interested in that option, please send an email directly to me, and our team can talk with you or a community you serve to see if we can provide some immediate help to you. Just again on the eligibility for TCTA, it is for local governments receiving or will receive federal transportation funding. That includes competitive grants, but it also includes regular formula funds that pass through state DOTs, with priority given to small to mid-sized communities. And with that, we spent most of the time on the polls. We do have a minute or two in the Q&A to answer anything that might be outstanding. Our contact information is here on the screen, and we're pleased that you joined us today.
And I will also thank Sumi, Kyle, and Jerry for the great presentation and all of you who participated. Really interesting interaction and ideas coming from all across the country. I do know a few of you had asked about the recording and the slides, and those will be available. You will all get an email about that. And you will also all have a feedback form after the seminar ends. If you could complete that brief survey, it would really help us out in terms of planning future events, and we always appreciate your feedback. And we do have 1 minute in case any other question comes through the Q&A that folks want to answer. And I also appreciate the folks on the Q&A who have answered and given other suggestions and sharing information. It's been great. We are at the end, and one came through. I'm going to let the folks from ICF answer that. It's about sort of eligibility of the technical assistance. And I'll make sure
I
someone
will
can
answer that.
answer before we
Yeah,
close out.
I'll answer that live. If it's for direct technical assistance, I would reach out to the HUD portal to discuss eligibility. If it's immediate technical assistance, we could talk about eligibility. The answer is it depends, but in the most likely case, it would be eligible. I would assume likely yes.
All right. With that, uh, do any of our other speakers want to say one last thing and before we close out? All right. Thank you, everyone.